Good morning, everyone. We want to welcome all of you to the continuing sessions of our SCRJ conference, The Wises, Einhorn and Beyond, Reclaiming and Renewing Our Reform Jewish Heritage for the 21st Century. We have been engaged now since yesterday in a really intriguing and meaningful encounter with so many of the key issues that engage us with our shared heritage as Reformed Jews. And that is the ultimate goal and vision of the Society for Classical Reform Judaism. We are not in any way positioning our commitment as the only option. We're not saying that everybody should, quote, go back to anything. We're talking about a renewed, revitalized expression of the historic minhag and the fundamental liberal spiritual values of our Reformed tradition as a vital, viable option for Reformed Jews today, as one of the many rich, diverse voices within the broader Reform movement. And the whole purpose of our continuing partnership with the college, both here in Cincinnati and in Jerusalem, is to share this vision with a new generation of our leadership who can bring this part of their heritage as Reform rabbis and cantors to their future leadership. Bottom line is that everything that has brought any of you here to this campus as a student, as a faculty member, as part of the administration, all the choices that you make, all the values that you hold dear are the legacy of our founders. And even if our perspectives today may be different, even if our ways of expressing those values might be different, it is that legacy that empowers us to make the many choices that we all are in a position to make today. We're going to today to focus on two of the liturgical aspects of the way in which classical Reform Judaism has informed and renewed the worship life and celebration life of our movement. We're going to first begin with a program right now where we're going to talk about a very timely issue of the way in which our classical Reform values and ideals can be brought into an understanding of the Passover Haggadah. And we're then going to follow that with an investigation of the principles and the issues that were involved in the preparation of the newest iteration of classical Reform liturgy, the Sinai revision of the Union Prayer Book. I'm now going to ask Rabbi Devin Lerner, who is the program director of the Society for Classical Reform Judaism, to introduce our speaker this morning and to continue setting the stage for this session.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It is my pleasure to introduce this morning Professor David Aaron, who is the professor of Hebrew Bible and History of Interpretation here at the Cincinnati campus. Actually, Professor Aaron and I, you may not remember, but we've crossed paths many times in the past because you were in Boston for many years and you studied, got your Ph.D. at Brandeis, among other things, and worked in the community. So our paths have crossed. And I was delighted to read your bio and to see just the wonderful collection and research and articles that you have written over these years. It's very exciting to me, so I'm looking forward to looking at them more in depth. I'm excited about introducing this today because yesterday we had a wonderful talk about history and so many different aspects that set the stage for us talking about the classical reform liturgy. And liturgy is where my own heart is in terms of where I connect to my own Jewish heritage, and wanted to say something about why the classical reform liturgy speaks to me. I mean, there's something about it that not only the English, but it's not just because a lot of it is in English, but the poetry of the passages really speaks to my heart. And the music, it's not only the inspiration of some you might call performance pieces, but also participatory pieces that just make that experience, it connects me to God, connects me to the eternal spirit of the universe in a way that other forms of Reformed worship do not. And that doesn't mean, I don't think the other forms are not valid, of course. That's part of what it means to be a Reformed Jew, is that we have different options of how we create our worship. But for me, this is a very powerful way of worship and connecting to heritage. And so it is a poetry, it's the music, and the combination of all of that. It comforts me, it connects me, inspires me, and that feeling of transcendence. So today, as we listen and learn from you about how to bring classical Reform Judaism to a contemporary reading of the Haggadah, I'm excited to hear about that. And what's also timely, not only is it Passover coming up, but also the Society is working on an update of the traditional Haggadah with the CCAR. So Rabbi Berman can say more about that, but we're in process, so we can't say too much at the moment. But it's exciting because the classical Reform tradition is an evolution. We're always updating what has come before to meet the needs of today, but also retaining the power of what has come before. So it was my great pleasure now to introduce Professor David Aaron.
So before I begin, I'm going to correct some typos in the handout. I used OCR and speech recognition software, and we're still primitive, so two of the typos are particularly bothersome. One is on page 2 of the handout, and it's under where it says Provisional Constitution of the World Union. In the first line, you will find the word prophets, and guess how it should really be spelled? Yes, so it is P-R-O-P. Okay, and the other is on that same page in the paragraph just above it, you see in the last long line it says codes themselves, just cross out the word and, themselves entitle us is what should be written. And above there are a couple little ones, but they won't be as bothersome as rabbinic prophets. So,
although we're not opposed to that.
We certainly seem to be.
Yeah, you'll be good to go now. Oh, you want that lower? Excuse me.
okay.
It's on.
Do you hear me there? That's good?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So this morning's going to be a lot different from yesterday. The reason it's a lot different is yesterday we had premier historians, intellectual historians of the 19th century, and today you have me, someone who gets nervous after the 12th century, serious problems if it's after Avram Ibn Ezra. I mean, for me, classical is... Okay, so why would I be speaking this morning? Well, I'm taking Howard Berman's challenge of the question of renewal very seriously. And my goal this morning is to just deal quite ideologically with the question of what a classical form of Reform Judaism would look like today. And in order to do that, I am going to draw upon some concepts that derive from the 19th century, quite deliberately and manipulatively chosen, in order to set the stage for certain ideas. And then I'm going to take the most significant challenge of 19th century Reform Judaism, which is the pursuit of truth and the use of reason, and ask ourselves, well, what does the pursuit of truth in the middle of the, or I should say the late 20th and early 21st century, where does it lead us regarding Torah? And given where it leads us, how should we then be rethinking the use of the Exodus story in the Haggadah? So I am endeavoring first to set the stage ideologically, and then to actually read text, and to show how that text might be rethought along lines that would be conceptually in harmony with classical Reform Judaism. To do that, I'm going to start by reading a small section from a book that's very dear to me, which probably would have factored into classical Reform Judaism in the 19th century had it been written then, but most certainly had an impact on Jews in the 20th century, and that's by Karl Mannheim, Ideology and Utopia. And about a third of the way into that book, he writes the following: "The attempt to escape ideological and utopian distortions is, in the last analysis, a quest for reality." We want to know what's real. We recognize we have our ideological preferences, but ultimately we want to know what's real. These two conceptions, that is, ideology and utopia, provide us with a basis for a sound skepticism. And they can be put to positive use in avoiding the pitfalls into which our thinking might lead us. So for Mannheim, that concept of reason, that concept of skepticism, is ultimately more important than the content that we are going to achieve. The content, at some level, we bring our skepticism to it and our questioning, if you will, our reasoning, and we can't anticipate that. The opposite is true of the ideology. The ideology starts with the premise that it believes in, and then everything else is going to be collapsed into that premise. Whereas Mannheim is saying, no, we're going to start with a quest for reality, and we're going to avoid, to the extent possible, shaping that reality on the basis of where we start. He goes on. Specifically, they can be used to combat the tendency in our intellectual life to separate thought from the world of reality, to conceal reality, or to exceed its limits. Thought should contain neither less nor more than the reality in whose medium it operates. Just as the true beauty of a sound literary style consists in expressing precisely that which is intended, in communicating neither too little nor too much, so the valid element in our knowledge is determined by adhering to, rather than departing from, the actual situation to be comprehended. So what Mannheim did is he created what we call a sociology of knowledge. It's about epistemology. And I take this to be a central element in classical Reform Judaism, because as we're going to now look at a variety of texts, the question of how we know what we know. What is legitimate Judaism? What are the forms to which we are obliged, or which we should in fact use to our benefit? These are questions of how we know what we know. Why do we believe what we believe on the basis of sources that we've inherited? So I'm taking Mannheim as sort of the mandate for how we might think of classical Reform Judaism, and then how we might use those initial thoughts to shape approaches to Reform Judaism today. If you'll turn then to the sheet, 3 pages that I've given you, or there are 6 pages double-sided, should say on the top, bringing classical Reform Judaism to a contemporary reading of the Exodus story and some implications for the Passover Haggadah. Okay. Does everyone have? Great. So here what I'm doing is I'm taking a collection of passages randomly, if you will. No, they're not random at all. They're quite deliberately ordered in the way they're ordered. And we're going to try to establish what we can use from these materials for a contemporary reading of the Haggadah. Isaac Mayer Wise, in the Occident, September 1850, where the Talmud imposes upon us doctrines with the observances of ceremonies which are foreign to the Bible and which, notice the language, infested us for many centuries with the spirit of intolerance and of separation, which degraded a religion into a compendium of blind and insignificant rites, which depressed the youthful spirit of Judaism and drove thousands from our community. He should have told us what he really thought. Huh? Or where the Talmud comes in conflict with the demands of our age, which, if listened to, will bring destruction and ruin in its train. The Talmud will bring destruction and ruin. There I am fearless on the side of reform. And if thousands of learned or not learned doctors say, if, I should have said, the Talmud is divine, I must 1,000 times pity them, for that they lack the moral courage to speak the truth. Now, what's astounding to someone living today who does biblical studies is how a classical Reform Jew in the middle of the 19th century could have been so blind to the fact that the biblical text has absolutely no priority over the Talmudic text when it comes to claims of divinity. In fact, we already understand since Spinoza that there were numerous strands within the intellectual life of Europe claiming quite strongly that the Bible had no connection with God. And more importantly, Spinoza did a great job of trying to show that his concepts of the authorial structure of the Pentateuch mostly was dependent upon Ibn Ezra. Right? Maimonides is in the theological tractate as well, but it's predominantly Ibn Ezra, and I have actually written on this where if you line up all of the passages that Spinoza cites in Ibn Ezra, you end up seeing that most of those passages are the place where Ibn Ezra indicates this could not have been written by God, or he ends the sentence with Hamaskil Yavin, the great intellectual will understand the implication, which of course Ibn Ezra cannot fully spell out. But Spinoza is delighted to take those passages in Ibn Ezra as if to show that don't think that I'm radical, because Ibn Ezra already showed us that these passages could not possibly have been written by God. So the priority of the Bible over rabbinic literature has to be rooted in something sociological. Why would the classical, of course not classical, didn't think of himself yet as classical, the innovative Reform Jew of the 19th century want to disparage rabbinic literature on the one hand, but remain blind, in a sense, to the problems in biblical authorship, which were quite part of academia that day, but also within the Jewish stream. So there are numerous reasons why, and I will leave it to the historians of the 19th century to sort that out, but on the surface I would suggest that the desire to be integrated, especially within the American community, would have made it deleterious to relate to scriptures as less than divine, given that its problem with law within scriptures, Torah as law, was also part of the Christian community, so that to say that there weren't equally divine elements in Torah that we can preserve the way the Christian was deciding to preserve that text would have been sociologically impossible. But intellectually, to claim that Bible has something divine and then have to throw out 3/4 of it, we'll see what Polheim and others do with that, especially Lilienthal, to throw out 3/4 of it because even though it is divine, you have to find a reason to be able to throw it out, we will see that this is intellectually cannot possibly withstand the developments in scholarship afterwards. So let's go to Holdheim here. I'm very consciously not quoting Holdheim directly. I had to decide whether to do this, but I wanted to use Jacob Pedachowski's summary of Holdheim. Those of us in the room who studied with him will hear his voice as I read this. So I can't quite pronounce the word Commonwealth the way he would have pronounced it, but his summary of Holdheim is itself a sociological object to be studied. And this is how Pedachowski summarizes. One element was the eternally valid religious law by which Holdheim meant the moral and ethical obligations which follow from a belief in ethical monotheism. But the same Torah also contains the constitution of ancient Hebrew Commonwealth, a theocracy centering around the national shrine, the Jerusalem temple, and officially hereditary priesthood, which was bound by the innumerable laws of Levitical purity and impurity. The whole ceremonial law of the Torah was connected with the priesthood, even as the priesthood was concerned with the temple, and the temple with the Jewish state. But, argued Holdheim, God let that temple be destroyed. In the year 70, God let that state be destroyed in the year 70. Therefore, the whole legislation, the whole constitution, which goes with temple and state, was put out of commission by Almighty God himself. It was God himself who abolished that part of the Torah which contains the constitution of the ancient Hebrew Commonwealth. All that remains for us to be found, us is to be found solely in the eternally binding moral and ethical commandments of the Torah. Okay, so on the one hand, we get rid of rabbinic literature because it has no divine element. On the other hand, we have Torah, which has divine elements which we don't like, but we're allowed to get rid of them because God himself intervenes in history and is able to say, you see, I meant you to have this a certain amount of time, but at a certain amount of time, at a certain point in time, I'm going to get rid of it. Now, the absurdity of such a concept might be lost, I guess, in the 19th century, but the notion of a deity who personally engineers human history is not exactly in harmony with a theology that can also adapt itself to the very principles that it is espousing here. That is, on the one hand, we have a God who gives Torah, and on the other hand, we have a God who is going to cause history to behave in such a way that it can eliminate parts of Torah for us. Now, I don't know, and I will leave it to the scholars in the room who are much more familiar with this literature than I, but I don't know that they cite Maimonides to come to this conclusion, but in the Guide for the Perplexed, Part 3, Chapter 32, Maimonides makes exactly this argument. He asked the question of what would happen if today a prophet were to come into your synagogue and say, God really does not require prayer. This is an ancient modality, and the reason that we had sacrifice and prayer is because we were primitive in that early stage, and Maimonides has a notion that we had to be brought to the present intellectual stage. So for Maimonides, of course, well, he has the Mishnah Torah for the plebeians. He doesn't need to actually daven 3 times a day. Right? It's left, of course, in that chapter in the Guide as a rhetorical question. It is not answered. What would happen if today a prophet came into your synagogue and said, we really don't need to pray anymore? So I don't know, and perhaps our discussion afterward will elucidate whether that passage in Maimonides ever served any of the classical reformers. I would suggest that it may or may not have, depending on how they were able to integrate the rest of Maimonides, the Mishnah Torah, and everything else, which, of course, within Maimonides is itself a contradiction. You'll notice that Maimonides wrote the Guide of the Perplexed in German. I mean, the equivalent of German. He writes it in Arabic, which, as we learned last night from Lance in terms of Einhorn, right? If to be a good Jew, you had to preserve the German. Well, to be a good Jew for Maimonides, you had to preserve that Arabic. How else could you ever express anything philosophical? So even the notion of using a vernacular in certain contexts could be traced back to Maimonides. Of course, the notion of needing to master science, while it's already hinted in Sajia Gaon, is a major principle in Avraham ibn Ezra, and Abraham ibn Ezra dies around 1167, 1168. So there are plenty of opportunities for us to see antecedents to certain types of thought. Whether they get used in the 19th century, that I think is an interesting question, why they would engage some antecedents and not others. Okay, so that's Holdheim. Now we go back to Samuel Adler, who writing, comes from while he is, this is a Pesach, and that's why I chose this. This is actually the last day of Pesach sermon, okay? And he writes, our situation, I think the imagery is fabulous, our situation is like unto that of the Israelites immediately after their deliverance from Egypt. Behind us lies Egypt, the Middle Ages. Before us, the sea of Talmudic legalism, whereof it may truly be said, all streams and rivulets discharge themselves into the sea, which is nevertheless never filled, nor yet ever cleansed should be through flood. Let then the rod be raised to cleave it. There's Moses' rod, right? Is going to cleave through the Talmud. Backwards we cannot go, and stand still means death. Then let us forward across the sea. Reason holds the rod. Reason is the leader. The Torah itself calls itself our wisdom. Incidentally, it does that in the book of Proverbs, but it mostly does that in rabbinic literature, where it's called an equivalent to tushiyah, right? The Hellenistic derived term for wisdom. Reason holds the rod. Reason is the leader. The Torah itself calls itself our wisdom and our understanding in the eyes of the nations. A violent east wind is being wafted and dries up the sea in this land of freedom. There's your America, right? We are crossing the sea in America. The spirit indwelling here in the West, the spirit of freedom, is the newly born God. Reason is our Savior. Reason is our Savior.
It's writing my Passovers.
There it is. There it is. Okay. We move then to Max Lilienthal. This comes from 1854. And in fact, this passage is what's going to lead me to go into the textual passages in Exodus in a moment. What Lilienthal writes here is remarkable. Whether agreed to or not, it is a fact that the belief in a great many things that 50 years ago were considered holy and sacred has been greatly shaken. What a fabulous idea, huh? So if we look back 50 years, the litany of things that have been, that were considered holy and sacred, in what way might they have been shaken? No one will be quieted. By the way, I say that as someone writing in the area of Bible and rabbinic literature. And perhaps my colleagues will reflect the same way. When I look just at my graduate education 30 years ago, there are very few remaining pillars. Very few remaining pillars. So we are in a time of rapid change. They were in a time of rapid change, but I would dare say that what is happening now, because of all the different media through which one can have information, the rapidity of change is now breathtaking. I was joking with Jonathan Cohen yesterday. We were commenting in our conversation about computers, and Jonathan Cohen mentioned that he has a brother-in-law who's one of the inventors of the notion of programming quantum computers. This morning, on the front page of the business section of the New York Times, it was announced that Martin Lockheed and a company called D-Wave are about to launch their first commercial quantum computer. Today, it was announced. A quantum computer is a non-binary system of computation. We have been in a binary world of computation since the 1930s, and then with Turing after that. And now we are about to go into a world of non-binary computing, a kind of machine that can do computations that will dwarf what is now available. So the rate of change, and what are the implications of that kind of thinking? How do we integrate that into our human minds? Amazing. The future is happening much faster than we would ever have imagined historically. So no one will be quieted by such sentences as the minhag of Israel is as binding as the law of Moses. Men of learning and profound reasoning have clearly shown the historical development of so many of our ceremonies, and the belief that the rabbinical law from A to Z has come down from Sinai has totally disappeared. Of course, we would now update that by saying the belief that anything in the Torah has come down from Sinai has, in a sense, totally disappeared, if one is studying biblical literature scientifically. Scientific researches, that is not a typo, that is his word, have proved that all nations and times have added to the store of our religious observances. This, by the way, is a remarkable insight on his part. His awareness, I mean, Geiger was already showing this, but his awareness that much of what we call Jewish is dependent upon the host culture. His awareness of this in the 1850s is quite impressive, and this, of course, is before we had great access to ancient Near Eastern literature. That's all going to come afterwards. So our ability to show, for instance, that biblical passages are close to Ugaritic passages, or close to Assyriological literature, or draws from Assyriological literature, or in some cases, even Egyptian literature. We had no ability to do that in the 19th century. Those findings are all after the fact. But his appreciation, sociologically, that Jewish practices themselves were dependent upon other societies is already quite forward-looking, quite advanced intellectually in terms of how he understands Jewish practice. Scientific researchers have proved, and I just did, that all nations and times have added to the store of our religious observances, and that all, therefore, cannot be as holy as the Bible. Further researches will, by the way, that's the problem. The Bible is the same, right? The Bible is also a syncretistic document, but he didn't quite see it that way. Further researches will restore our religion to its primitive purity. That, of course, is the idea. It's almost Neoplatonic, right? We will rid ourselves of the bodily, the impure, and go to the perfect primitive, which would be the forms. So that's what he's looking to do. And simplicity will remove each and every contest and unite us again in the firm belief in the Holy One, for whom our fathers suffered and for whom also we, their descendants, are ready to make every sacrifice. We are no reformers from inclination, no reformers for fashion's sake, no reformers for conviction. We do not belong to that frivolous or arrogant class that do away and abolish the abolition of, what did I skip? Abolish because it suits them just now. No, what we assert we intend to prove. In other words, there's a scientific process to making your religion correct. And where we shall move the abolition of any ceremony, we shall not do it without showing that the religious codes themselves entitle us to demand such a change and such a reform. Last night, when the discussion was occurring, and David, you mentioned that notion of how much knowledge they have, right? The project here is you couldn't possibly be a Reformed Jew without knowing all the material. The commitment to learning the sources for Lilienthal has to be the premise by which reform takes place, because it has to be rational. It has to be justified in terms of the thinking of the day. Notice he's very attuned to that. So how much source material would we have to know today to be able to reform? I think that's a really important question.
I think given the date of 1854, it might be a reaction to the founding of JTS and Breslau and the differentiation between Frankel's way of looking at Judaism, which he seems to be attacking here, and how he views the more, quote, normative reform.
Right. Right, but he's still grounding us. He wants Frankel's charge was the sourcelessness of the reform, right?
Yeah.
So he's quite attuned to that. Finally, before we get to the Haggadah itself, I wanted to bring two statements from Provisional Constitution of the World Union in 1926. This, of course, also comes from Phillipson's updated volume. I think the original was 1907. Wasn't Phillipson originally 1907?
Yes.
Yes, and then he updated it in 1931. So here's what we read. The World Congress of Progressive Judaism, inspired by the beliefs of the prophets in the mission of Israel to spread the knowledge of God, declares that that belief lays upon Israel the duty to work for a further recognition by Jews and by all mankind of the religious and ethical demands of righteousness, brotherly love, and universal peace. The World Congress, convinced of the capacity for development in the Jewish religion, and here that concept of development, right, is what I'm going to try to pivot off of in just a moment, declares that it is the duty of each generation of Jews to bring the religious teachings and practices of their fathers into harmony with developments in thought, advances in knowledge, and changes in circumstances in life. Okay, so this last sentence, developments in thought, advances in knowledge, and changes in circumstances in life, is what we now have to ask ourselves. Where is the source of those developments, advances, and changes in circumstance? So the changes in circumstance, we all know. We live in the world. We are integrated into the world. The question then becomes, where are the developments in thought and advances in knowledge? Well, what is clear, putting Isaac Mayer Wise and Einhorn aside, who had not very little to do with the state of biblical research in the 19th century, at this institution, there has been no hesitancy to endeavor to present whatever currents were taking place in scholarship as the approach to the text, historical criticism, if you will. The interesting development of that, even with this institution, and again, I will turn to those who are far more expert in this than I, but the interesting development is that in the beginning part of the 20th century, the options for a Jewish scholar to both teach and publish were quite limited. In fact, a conversation with Michael Meyer the other day indicated that the original purpose of the Hebrew Union College Press was to offer our faculty the opportunity to publish books in an era where the publication of Jewish-related scholarship was exceptionally difficult. So you did have a Harry Oswald Wolfson at Harvard, but of course Philo and Spinoza and church fathers, right, his areas of public, didn't exactly threaten. Kreskis, I guess, didn't he do his big book on Kreskis would be the most Jewish, and then one wonders about Kreskis. But the point being that the options were so few that Hebrew Union College forms its press as a place for its Jewish scholars to publish. Today, look at the options. Today, the world is so radically different. So we not only expect our scholars to be up to date in what is happening intellectually, but we are able to participate as Jewish scholars in the larger world of discourse without any hesitation, but without barriers, pretty much without barriers. Howard, remind me, till what time do we?
We are playing till 11:15.
Okay. So this change, this notion that the developments in thought, advances in knowledge, and changes in circumstances of life, this is now different from just 80, 70, 60 years ago. And in a certain effect, the Hebrew Union College, especially in its graduate program, has experienced the transformation of contemporary circumstances, because 50 years ago, if you wanted to study Jewish studies, the number of places you could do that was so few. Today, there isn't a major university in the world that doesn't have some program related to Jewish studies. It may not be the breadth of Hebrew Union College or Jewish Theological Seminary, but rather prodigious. So the world is changed, and where we get our knowledge, where we will decide what a contemporary classical Reform Judaism will look like, what are its sources of research, I think that needs to be discussed. That has to be something that the contemporary world, based on these readings, has to be conscious of. Okay. I am going to now switch and offer a very small olat tamid, a very small offering, not so tamid. And with that, try to show one way contemporary biblical scholarship might change the way we think about the Exodus story. And in showing how we might think about the Exodus story, I am using contemporary scholarship. And as it happens, I've chosen this particular example because as it happens, contemporary scholarship supports strongly the reading of the Exodus story that we have in the 1923 CCAR Union Haggadah. This is, they couldn't possibly have known the ideas that I'm about to present, but they came to the same conclusions for other reasons, but it gives us the opportunity to see how scholarship can in fact intersect with ideological goals. So, on the bottom of page 2, I have the end of that paragraph that comes after the Dayenu, right? And the Dayenu prayer elucidates all of the miracles. And you get to the end of the Dayenu prayer, and you have a paragraph which is the summary paragraph. All good things in Reformed Judaism, in Rabbinic Judaism, love redundancy, right? So if you don't say it twice, you better then say it 3 times, and if you said it 3 times, then maybe you finally got it. So we say Dayenu, we sing Dayenu. If you want afterwards, we can break out in the chorus. And then we do this summary paragraph. God has bestowed many favors upon us. This is the traditional text, right? Had he brought us out of Egypt and not executed judgments against the Egyptians, it would have been enough. Dayenu. Had he executed judgments against the Egyptians and not their gods, it would have been enough. Had he put to death their firstborn and not given us their riches, it would have been enough. Had he given us their riches and not split the sea for us, so forth and so on, you get the point. How much more so, then, should we be grateful to God for the numerous favors that he bestowed upon us? He brought us out of Egypt and punished the Egyptians. He smote their gods and slew their firstborn. He gave us their wealth and split the sea for us. He led us through it on dry land and sunk our foes in it. He sustained us in the desert for 40 years and fed us with the manna. He gave us the Sabbath and brought us to Mount Sinai. He gave us the Torah and brought us to Israel. He built the temple for us to atone for our sins. So now we flip, and now we have the Union Haggadah 1923, which I understand is the revised edition. And here's how we see they relate to this exact same singing of Dayenu. How manifold are the favors which God has conferred upon us. Had he brought us out of Egypt and not divided the sea for us, Dayenu. Had he divided the sea for us and not permitted us to cross the dry land, Dayenu. What's missing? All the plagues. The plagues are missing. The plagues are missing. And for good reason. It's embarrassing and not universal, right? So the plagues are missing. The Dayenu starts with brought us out of Egypt, and then goes right to the sea. How much more then are we to be grateful unto the Lord for the manifold favors, should be favors which he has bestowed upon us. He brought us out of Egypt, divided the sea, there again splits it, right? Sustained us for 40 years, manna, Sabbath, Mount Sinai, Torah, does have land of Israel, the temple, and so forth. Made us a holy people to perfect the world under the kingdom of the Almighty in truth and in righteousness. So, an attempt to break down the story, to use it. Of course, the other major element in this Haggadah is the removal of the majority of rabbinic-based legends, right? The Maaseh, the events of the rabbi staying up all night, the instances where the disciple comes in and says it's time for Kriyat HaShema. All of these different elements are removed because anything that would have been rabbinic, as we just read, if it's Talmudic, it's pretty much not kosher in that sense. But I want to point out very significantly, the rabbinic Haggadah represents an audacious reformation of the practice. Okay? So we shouldn't think that their attempt to change the Haggadah is somehow not in the spirit of what the Haggadah is. Another context, I hope you get to hear Michael Cook speak about the Haggadah and its intersection with certain concerns, we'll call it, in Christianity. But the factors that are shaping the Haggadah cause a kind of radical rethinking of Passover. Why? If you want to know the story of Passover, how would you get it? You start in Exodus 1 and you end in Exodus 15. Dayenu, the story is finished. But the rabbis don't do that at all. They eliminate the biblical story, actually use the Deuteronomy version of the story to begin the narrative, displace large sections of the narrative by inserting their own attempt to reformulate the Passover, and do something which is unthinkable. They perpetuate a home ritual in place of what was, we assume during the Second Temple period, predominantly a cultic ritual. So the Haggadah itself, unfortunately, we've inherited in terrible condition, right? The Haggadah is a mess. If you really sit down and try to read the four sons, for instance, or even the four questions, you cannot possibly make sense of them. You have to go back to the Mishnah, you have to go back to manuscripts to see that they have been really corrupted in many ways by the transmission process. So the Haggadah itself is a radical reform approach to Passover. So the fact that we have another attempt to undermine some of the aspects of the rabbinic text is perfectly in line. In other words, the Reformed Judaism might have seen itself as doing exactly what rabbinic literature did, which was to undermine the conceptions of the literature that came before it. So keep that in your mind as we now move through the biblical material.
Another possibility on the plagues is, I think after World War I, Reformed Judaism very broadly identified with pacifism. Leofek was the international.
Kronbach.
And Kronbach and others right here. We stopped talking about hanging the sons of Haman at the same time, and interestingly, we still don't hang the sons of Haman very much in the Reform movement. We've brought the plagues back, so we've been kind of selective.
Well, I think it's not only selective. I think that it's a somewhat, there's a lack of thought what these texts might mean.
Well, we now have little plastic flies that we could use at the tables to bring the plagues back.
Yeah. Made in China.
The other thing is, in terms of...
I think that change was already present in 1907.
What's that?
Was it not?
Yeah, I thought they removed the plagues in 1907.
The other thing I would think about would be, at some point they introduced illustration.
Oh yes, 1923 has lots of illustration.
Addition, and I don't know whether or not the plagues made it back.
No, I looked quite carefully.
Okay, that's what I was
No, the plagues themselves are not there in the illustrations.
All right.
The sea is split, and there are other illustrations. The baby on the river, if I remember, I don't remember them all. But no, the plagues are not there. Yeah, they're not depicted. Yeah, black and white illustrations around the edges. Yeah, very nice. Obviously, very nicely done. Yeah. No, I think I had the 1907 out too. I don't think the plagues are there either. So while pacifism certainly became, look, I'm very interested in Kronbach, and of course his whole philosophy of how Reformed Judaism needed to embrace pacifism. Gary, we have to have someone do a thesis on this. Is we must have the documents, don't we have his paper? Yeah. Right, the problem came with Second World War, is how could a Jew be a pacifist with Hitler raging against European Jewry?
But the broader point you were making, leaving out the question of just the plagues itself, namely the non-universalism, the notion of vengeance with the plagues. Already in the 19th century, the Kedushat, the Yotzer, they're already taking out all the passages.
Shefoch.
Yes, that's one of my favorites.
Pour out your wrath.
Yeah.
But also in the Avinu Malkeinu, one way, when you're doing a study of 19th century prayer books, certain passages you just look to see if there are reforms and what are otherwise non-reform, but fairly traditional positive historical prayer books. Nakom nikmat dam avadecha hashafuch.
Take vengeance.
Take vengeance on those who spilled your blood. That
That's
passage
removed.
was taken out in the 1830s
Yeah.
and 40s and some of these.
Fabulous. Fabulous. So there is, well, I'll show in a moment why I do think that the plagues were an embarrassment intellectually, and we're going to see in a moment that there were biblical authors who also did not want them there. And I will show that, I hope to show that we have a phenomenal source for arguing that the plagues are not original to the story, and that the purpose for the plagues is actually ideologically driven at a late stage of the development of the story. Are there other comments? Okay. So now we get to a period where I feel a little more comfortable. So this is the beginning of the Moses engagement with God. And what I have done here is, you'll see in the top paragraph, I hope yours looks blue. At the bottom, I've put in blue the beginning of that narrative where we get into the question of God's name, which is, in terms of the literature, a catastrophe. There are about 5, 6 different generations trying to make sense of what God's name is. So we're not going to read that because it disturbs. Maybe I need to back up a minute. In contemporary biblical scholarship, we are almost at the 50-50 point. What does that mean? 50% of scholars are still working with JEPD, the documentary hypothesis. 50% of the scholars have abandoned it. When I started my graduate studies, we were at 30-70. So there has been change.
What does that mean, abandoned, for those of us?
So there are alternate approaches to the writing of biblical literature. JEPD was essentially a linear progression of biblical writing. The goal was, from the 19th century, to be able to proclaim that there was truly old literature. There was no way to date that literature. We had no manuscripts. Prior to the Masoretic texts, in the 19th century, we didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course. But the notion was that if you had an author that you could at least say is writing during David's time, that person is close to the history they're describing. Then, of course, there was the notion that we even have some older literature. So, for instance, Judges 5 was thought to be contemporaneous to the period of the Judges. So you had a linear progression. You had J, the Yahwist, using that name of God, writing in the 10th century. You then had a northern author writing in the 9th century, called E. Then you had these sources put together, probably in the 8th century. All the meanwhile, you have different prophets who are writing independent books, and they are being lined up with these schools. It is essentially linear. So along come a group of scholars in the 1970s, and they point out, this model of linear development causes not only more problems than it solves, but it's not true to what we can see in the text. So for instance, we can now show that motifs drawn from external literature are then adapted in Israelite literature, not once, sometimes twice, and sometimes 3 times. So if I look, for instance, at the story of Lot, which has this marvelous, violent story of the townsfolk trying to rape 2 men, right? And then I jump to the story in Judges 19, where I have this marvelous story of the townsfolk trying to rape the man, just one there. In both stories, the women are to be substituted for the male rape. In other words, to show the depravity of Sodom and Gomorrah, they go to the most horrible crime imaginable, and that would be raping the men. This is the theme used in Genesis 19. The exact same motif is used in Judges 19. The characters are adapted, The situation is adapted. In Genesis, we want to discredit Sodom and Gomorrah. In Judges, we want to end up with the Benjaminite Wars, right? To show the depravity of the situation in Judges 20 and following. So if we begin looking at the way the literature is written, it's not linear at all. It's an adaptation of elements within a cultural repertoire that are going to serve authors as they needed to be served. And of course, we can go example by example and show numerous of these. Some of them I touched upon in Etched in Stone, the book that I try to show the sequencing of text using the Ten Commandments. But an array of approaches to the composition of the Bible start developing from the 1970s onward. They reach a kind of pinnacle at the beginning of the 21st century with a group of scholars who not only are undermining the notion of the documentary hypothesis, but they're even questioning quite significantly the dating of our literature. And that is where we are at now. Am I buzzing?
No, it's if a cell phone is on in the room.
Okay. So where this will lead, I'm not sure, but when I say we're at 50-50, we have about 50%. If you go to the Society of Biblical Literature, you will hear some scholars still clinging to their JEPD as if that were to collapse. I mean, Richard Elliott Friedman, who's become a millionaire on this, Who Wrote the Bible, has just recently, within the last 5 years, produced a Bible which is color-coded, where you can see, and if you look at that Bible, your mind goes crazy. How is it possible that individuals wrote 3 words, and then the next 7 are written by someone else, and the next 9 are written by someone else, and then you come back to the other? I mean, it makes no sense. That's not how literature is formed.
You know, I'll just say, I received I don't know if you saw the recent issue of Reformed Judaism, not only an article by Michael Cook, but there's an article by David, or an excerpt of the book of David Sperling's. I'll only say that this professor was in touch with me, extremely upset that Reformed Judaism would publish David Sperling's work that contends that there are perhaps doubts. I think David would state it more strongly about the existence of historical Moses.
Well, David already did that in his book called The Original Torah.
Well, that's, yeah.
And it was quite beautifully.
But Richard was very upset that they published.
Well, that's too bad. I mean, David Sperling, I think, has brilliantly argued that the Aaron character is added to the story very late when they needed to justify the priesthood. That you have an original Exodus story, and the priests who are now in charge, I'll talk a little bit about the production of literature. You always have to think of how is literature produced. And Alec, you can tell us how literature is produced today, but in the old days, you had to have a monetary structure, and I assume you do today, in order to bring out a book. It just didn't appear. Someone had to support the scribe. Some school of thought had to be behind it. So what David Sperling is arguing is that there's no function to the Aaron story. Have you ever read that thing where Moses says, I can't speak well, and so they insert Aaron, and suddenly he's walking out to Midian, right, to meet Moses, to go. This is absurd, but this was clever. In other words, the priest saying, wait a minute, we've got to write ourselves into this story. So by saying we have to write ourselves into the story, they say, what options do we have? And David Sperling articulates, one option is get the priests into the original narrative to show that we were there all along. And of course, that's why Leviticus is in the middle of the Torah. You also make your book the most important book. Now, we have problems, because you'll remember that Moses had to be put on the river because the sons were being killed, right? But it would have been nice if Moses had been the firstborn, because that would have had gorgeous parity with the last plague, which is the firstborn. But if Moses were the firstborn, then Aaron would have problems being the firstborn in order to be the high priest. You see all the tensions? David writes about this wonderfully. So, yes, David is in the 50%.
I just thought you'd find Richard's comment interesting.
Yeah. I would suggest that it takes sometimes a generation or two for trends in scholarship to change, because it matters who is training which graduate students and where they then end up teaching. That said, there are some of us who like to pride ourselves in keeping up with research, and when something is convincing, I mean, David Sperling is a generation before me, and yet he is totally embraced. He has seen the light, as it were. So in effect, Judaism moving forward has to now think differently about how it will use Torah, and in this case, as I hope to show, it's quite liberating. And there doesn't need to be an apologetic for recognizing that no story has a singular component. We can decide theologically to emphasize one form of the story over another. Okay, so here we are now. Moses, tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priests of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. I wondered whether anyone in classical Reform Judaism used Horeb, or was it always Sinai? Do you know of such a source?
Doesn't it appear in some of the songs?
Horeb?
Yeah, like in the translations of, maybe Gadai, Gustav Gadai, I'll have to look, but if you look in the Union hymnal, I'll bet it appears.
Because what's so interesting is that Horeb, being the Deuteronomist take on the story, fits classical Reform Judaism much better than Sinai. Because
if it's in this hymns, it's probably just because it rhymes.
It rhymes. Interesting.
Father, see thy suppliant children, the confirmation and call Sinai.
Yes, that's right. When we sang that in confirmation, I knew I.
Is it because of the rhyme, do you think?
No. Father, see thy suppliant children come before you. Now we knew the vowel of Horeb.
Fabulous. Fabulous. So, but what's interesting is we named the periodical Sinai, not Horeb, and
was it Hirsch?
What?
There is
Samson Raphael.
he identified with Horeb. Okay. So,
did believe in rabbinic.
right. So, an angel of the Lord appeared to him. This, by the way, the words angel of the Lord are likely an insertion into the text, because as we're going to see, it's not an angel of the Lord, it is God himself. Appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was not consumed. Moses said, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, he answered, here I am. Even, by the way, the notion of calling someone twice, tons of literary evidence for this in ancient Near Eastern literature. This is the way you call someone, right? You use that name twice. By the way, that goes back quite early. Here I am, he said, do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground. Okay, so you've all heard the story before, and the question then becomes, what happens next? So what happens next is we go into this scene of doubting, self-doubting, right? Moses has a problem. He's been living in the suburbs and he's going downtown. No one knows him downtown. Right? He's been living in Midian, and he's about to go back to talk to his compatriots. Notice how beautifully constructed this is. This is the standard notion of the displacement of the hero. We have this motif dozens of times preserved in ancient Near Eastern literature. Sargon is the earliest example, where the person who is destined to become king is sent off. That's the tension in the story. Even Oedipus Rex has the notion, of course. So you have this concept that the person who's destined to be king is endangered, sent off to someplace else, and yet fate has it, or God as it were, that the person will come back and deliver. I wish to point out that the entire Exodus story, including the giving of our Torah, takes place where? In exile. Maybe I should turn this off. Is that?
Well, you know what? The only way if people will turn off their cell phones, it'll stop. If you have it, it just has to be turned off.
As it interferes with the FM.
Picks up the wireless.
Okay. So notice that the entire story of our Torah takes place in exile. We get our Torah not in the land. Of course, we all sing Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, for our Torah comes out of Zion, that's the old theology, the pre-exilic theology. But once we're exiled, we change so that Torah does not come from Zion. How embarrassing would that be? Zion lays in ruins. Zion is now, after the exile, in ruins, so therefore a new mythology emerges. Torah comes from Sinai, out in the wilderness. Why? Because if you are a Jew living in Babylon or Hoboken, New Jersey, what good is it to think that Torah comes out of Zion? If Torah can come out of the wilderness, it can be propagated anywhere. And the brilliance of situating the deliverance of Torah in the wilderness is, in my opinion, a strategy meant to accommodate those Jews who are living as we are in the diaspora. So we see even the situating of the story itself is devised for a diaspora community. You have all of our redemption take place in a foreign land. That land is now allegorically adaptable to wherever you live. And the deliverance does not take place when you get to Jerusalem. In fact, the Torah doesn't ever bring us there, right? The Torah ends in the wilderness. We have been given Torah in the wilderness, and there is no expectation that something will come from the land of Israel beyond what the other narratives pursue. So, we now have a story that is developing in diaspora. It is developing in Egypt. And the people writing this story have a strategy. And the strategy is going to take us to create a moment of redemption. If you read the biblical text carefully, you'll notice that there are multiple moments of redemption. So what I have done here, for convenience sake, is I've tried to present the two early options. The two early options were probably written by two different schools of thought, and they get fused. Sounds a little bit like gates of prayer, huh? Multiple options get fused. So here we had two different schools of thought. One school of thought, Israel and Egypt, has a story that has plagues, no magic, and no sea. I'll explain it all in a moment. The other story has magic, the sea, no plagues. So let's look at what it is like. I'm going to start with number 2. Moses spoke up and said, this is chapter 3, "What if they is the Israelites, do not believe me and do not listen to me, but say, the Lord did not appear to you?" The Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" And he replied, "A rod." He said, "Cast it on the ground." He cast it on the ground, it became a snake, and Moses recoiled from it. And the Lord said to Moses, "Put out your hand and grasp it by the tail." He put out his hand, he seized it, and it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, did appear to you. Okay, here's our first magic act. For whom is the magic directed? Israelites, not Pharaoh. The goal of the magic is to convince the Israelites that Moses is the real thing. Okay, we go on. The Lord said to him further, "Put your hand into your bosom." He put his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out, the hand was encrusted with snowy scales. He said, "Put your hand back into your bosom." He put it back into his bosom, and you all know the story. It comes out perfectly healthy. "And if they do not believe you or pay heed to the first sign, they will believe the second sign. And if they are not convinced by both these signs and still do not heed you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and it, the water that you take from the Nile, will turn to blood on the dry ground." Ooh, that got someone thinking. So I've got 3 magic tricks. All of the magic tricks are targeted at the Israelites to convince them regarding Moses' authenticity. Clear enough, right? Okay. Let's go on with what happens. In our Torah, we have no scene in which the magic is performed for the Israelites. When is the magic performed? For Pharaoh. So if you look on the column next to you, when the story ends up integrating the plagues, someone said to himself, I've got to use this magic story a little bit differently, because the whole purpose, the target of the story is going to change. So whereas I had this magic story, which was going to be for you, the Israelites, to believe that Moses was the real thing, now that I'm integrating another story, which is going to be my plague story, I can't leave the magic that way. I'm going to use it differently. So how does he use it? He's now going to use the magic tricks to justify the plagues. Look what he does. This is now Exodus 7. The Lord replied to Moses, see, I place you in the role of God to Pharaoh with your brother Aaron as your prophet. We won't go into the controversy of that line. You shall repeat all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh and so forth. And then he'll harden the heart. We'll go into why that is the case, okay? So we have here verse 8. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh speaks to you and says, produce your marvel, you shall say to Aaron, take your rod and cast it down before Pharaoh. It's the exact same trick. But now, Aaron is doing it for Moses in front of Pharaoh. We've rewritten the trick. So Moses and Aaron came before Pharaoh and did just as the Lord had commanded. Aaron cast down his rod in the presence of Pharaoh and his courtiers, and it turned into a serpent. Then Pharaoh, for his part, summoned the wise men and the sorcerers and the Egyptian magicians, in turn did the same with their spells. In other words, we're defanging the value of the magic tricks. We're doing one-upsmanship. Since Pharaoh's got magicians just as good as Aaron, we might as well now be able to pull out the big guns, right? In other words, if the magic isn't going to work, we're going to need the other narrative. So I need it to be very clear what's happening. The version of the story that someone envisioned had Moses using magic tricks to get the Israelites to believe in him. That story has no plagues. The redemption of Israel from Egypt in that story, just like our Union Haggadah of 1907, is the redemption at the sea. So if you turn to page 5, you will see that we have redemption at the sea. Then I will stiffen Pharaoh's heart. He will pursue them. I may gain glory through Pharaoh and all of the hosts. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. The reason for the sea is to defeat Egypt's armies with Pharaoh at its head, and that will prove that God is a God of history. So I have magic showing Moses' power. I have a series of stories which we've now lost. And I then have the quintessential redemption. Israel going before a sea which it cannot cross. Moses will split the sea. Pharaoh will pursue. Moses and the Israelites cross the sea, and God engineers history to destroy the Egyptians. Brilliant story of history and how Egypt is redeemed from its diaspora. Now, someone had a different idea, and that different idea is far more theological, but not monotheistic. There are trends in our Hebrew Bible that are not monotheistic at all. They are monolatristic. That means the Israelites, these authors, believed that multiple gods existed, but as in the word idolatry is worship of an idol. Monolatry is worship of one deity, but not the notion that the other deities don't exist. When you recite, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, who is like you among the deities, you are basically reciting a text that comes from a monolatristic background, the notion that the Israelite God is superior, but not exclusively the only deity. So this strain of thought is much more interested in defeating the Egyptian gods. So it became popular in the 1950s. Actually, a cluster of German scholars noted that most of the plagues are actually plagues against parts of nature that were controlled by discrete Egyptian deities. So if you'll turn to the last page, I've given here a chart of the plagues. So the Exodus story has 10. Blood, frogs, lice, or insects, they're combined, right? Pestilence, boils, hail, locust, darkness, and then Well, the last one is death of the firstborn. Okay? Now, if you'll notice, we have two other places in which the plagues are mentioned. Psalm 105 and Psalm 78. According to Nahum Sarna, and I'll go with his count here, because it's a little difficult to count since some plagues have multiple words for the same plague, there are only 7 plagues in these stories, and they don't line up. The order is different. You can tell by the colors or the words. The order is different. Not only is the order different, it would suggest that they didn't have quite the same agenda. Now, are these plagues all related to nature? Well, blood, yes. That God who controls the Nile, if you can make that river undrinkable, that's pretty impressive. And Svaradea, frogs, it turns out that frogs are the symbol of fertility. And in Egypt, if you wanted the gods to be favorable, you put those scarabs. You've probably seen those. Chicago has them in their museum. Boston Museum has them. Beautiful Egyptian scarabs of frogs. So if you can destroy fertility, then you are affecting the gods. And then you have the pestilence, all of these different things. If you add up all of the plagues, and they do appear, in fact, to be things that gods control, there's only one plague that does not fit. That's because between 105 and Psalm 78, you end up with 9 different plagues. If you combine them, you have, and they like 10. Nahum Sarna shows beautifully, they like everything in groups of 3 plus 1, right? 3, 3 plus 1, or 3, 3, 3 plus 1. They don't like 9. So to get to 10, they had to invent another plague. And the one they invent is the plague of the dermatologist. Boils. Boils is the only plague for which we have no sense that there was a god. But there was a dermatological lobby. That was a joke. Okay. In any event, the point is that the person who invented boils was clueless as to the purpose of the plague story. Because the Psalms have reflect 2 early versions of this story, and they got it right. And if you'll look in chapter 12 of Exodus, we have this notion of Eseh Shvatim Belohehem. I will execute justice or judgment against your gods. The whole point of the plagues is to show that Yahweh is more powerful than the Egyptian gods. This story was not popular in biblical literature. No one else knows of this story in this fashion. No prophet reflects it. Ezekiel has 2 passages in which he talks about that if the Jews were living in Egypt that long, they must have believed in the gods of the Egyptians, and he has them get rid of Gilulehem, their idols. Otherwise, this story of integrating the plagues, no of the biblical writers outside of the Torah cash into it until much later. Much later. So, what is the evidence? The evidence is we had 2 groups wanting to create this notion of Israel in Egypt. Why? Because we were, after the exile, a diaspora community. And in order to address our problems of diaspora, we needed to know that we could have a religion that was not in the land, was not nation-based, was not priestly. We needed to be able to have Passover without having a temple for the cult. 2 stories are created. One, very much interested in redemption being a historical event. The redemption at the sea is invented as this paradigm of God interceding in nature, splitting the sea and allowing us to escape, to become free. But notice, where do we become free? In a wilderness. The story never brings us into the land. It's going to take different authors to get us to the land. An alternative story emerged. The alternative story was, I'd like it to be a little more theological in a bit more concrete manner. Not only that, I'd like us to feel vengeance. So we devise a story of plagues. Originally, the authors came up with 7. 7 gods of Egypt, 7 powers in Egypt. We're going to show our God, Yahweh, more powerful, so we're going to show that the Nile can't be controlled by their God, it can be controlled by our God. We're going to show that fertility, animals, pestilence, right, devil. We're going to show that the crops can be wiped out by locusts, because we're going to defeat the Egyptian gods. That story becomes rather popular. Not only does it become popular, it ends up dominating our story. Why? Because the fragments of the other story, where we see Moses getting the magic tricks for the Israelites, and then we jump to see Moses redeemed at the sea, we don't know how that story would have read in between, because chapter 7 through chapter 11 now elucidate the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues themselves are quite interesting because it's all about chosenness, right? In chapter 4 of Exodus, God says to Moses that he is supposed to tell Pharaoh that we are his firstborn. Israel, the whole entity is his firstborn. So therefore, it's midah neged midah. It's measure for measure. Just as Israel is my firstborn, I will kill your firstborn, Pharaoh. Right? All of these parodies within the story. So what I hope to show here is, if we look at the evolution of the biblical story itself, there were authors who were quite content to situate us in a state of exile. Egypt, I would argue that Egypt is the allegory for Babylon. Why can't you write about Babylon directly? Well, because if you're still living there, you do not exactly want to talk about the Babylonians as these horrible people. But the Egyptians, by this point in history, have gone way down. They hardly represent a threat, and for that reason, we can write an allegory about Egypt, but we can't write an allegory about Babylon, using Babylon directly. It's no longer an allegory if you were using Babylon directly. So we situate ourselves in Egypt. We create a narrative. One school believed that the narrative needs to be of a certain type. God intervenes in history in a certain way. They come up with the narrative, initially of the magic, and then of the redemption at the sea. Another school says, let's get a little bit more pyrotechnics in here. And they create a very impressive story, but quite brutal, with all sorts of moral issues about what is this kind of God who hardens the heart of Pharaoh in order to inflict more plagues? What is the implication of that? They go with it. They get to their 10 plagues. The person who writes our Torah story is not the originator of that story. We see that because the Psalms know of only 7 plagues, not 10. We end up with the final reduction of our Torah, where someone says, this is a bestseller. The plagues are going to work. People are going to love singing Dayenu. And they go with it. And if you read the Torah narrative and you say to yourself, why do we have 2 redemption scenes? We're redeemed in Egypt with death of the firstborn. And from that is integrated Pesach and Matzah. But then we get out there and we're redeemed a second time. Which in a sense takes away a little bit from that big redemption of Pesach and Matzah. And in the end, we have an integrated text, which contemporary scholarship now permits us to break apart, not according to a documentary hypothesis, but according to the notion that discrete schools of Judaism existed, were writing stories to promote their own ideology. We know of many stories from other pieces of literature where that literature no longer exists. The literature has been lost to us. But at least in this case, our archaeological excavation of the sources, based on contemporary scholarship, permits us to see a vision of the Jew in exile and the Jew's redemption from exile, which is at odds with the story that now dominates our Exodus narrative. Questions or thoughts?
little bit tangential, but I remember hearing of how the story was taught in, I would say probably in the 60s in I don't know what type of reform setting, but I was told that the plagues were supposed to be all explained by natural phenomena.
Yes, well, this was there was actually an author named Velikovsky, a Russian guy who he wrote a number of books which basically endeavored to explain all of them naturally. Yes. Yeah.
And I guess in terms of for classical reform, the idea of knowledge and of science being able to explain things. There's a tension here, obviously, that in the Haggadah, it's just they're taken out completely. But in the sense, you still feel like you have to explain it. So
well, let me comment on this. We have in Judaism since the 17th century a phenomenon since the Enlightenment, which has to do with the fact that we think that history has to be written in only one way, and that is that history can never, that truth is not captured through fiction. Truth can't be captured through fiction. It has to have a high degree of verisimilitude. I would suggest that we work very hard as leaders in Jewish communities to abandon this notion. If you were to say, if you wanted to educate someone about the Holocaust, would you ask them to read Lucy Davidovich's book, War Against the Jews, or send them to see Schindler's List? I'd send them to see Schindler's List. Maybe I'd ask them to read Lucy Davidovich afterwards. But when Elie Wiesel comes out of the concentration camps, what's the first thing he does? He writes a novel. He doesn't write a textbook because he understands that there are literary forms. If your goal is to grasp truth, reality in some meaningful sense, it doesn't mean you have to describe every chair in this room. So one way to approach the meaning of our existence is to discuss it through stories that are allegorical for everything that is real. But the objects themselves of the allegory are not real. They correspond to things in life, but they themselves are not the point. So the ability, if you read Gulliver's Travels, you will read about a surreal world in which the critique of Swift's contemporary life is as biting and as critical a critique as imaginable. And yet nothing he writes about is historical, we would say, but in fact it's all historical. The modality of using allegory is the most powerful way to capture history, because to write pedantically about the shape of this table, about the number of chairs, who was sitting in each chair, gains very little with regard to meaning. So that's what I would suggest. Other thoughts?
When did they add in the emptying full glass of wine, since we're not supposed to drink a full glass because of the plagues?
Oh, where you drip out? I don't know, is that a medieval custom? Yeah, pretty late. Yeah, pretty late. Medieval. The integration of Elijah into the Haggadah is pretty late.
Was this idea of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart also, was that a later addition to the story, or was that the 10 plagues in the Bible, or was that part of the original?
Well, I think that they needed to get to 10, because really, how many plagues do you need? 1. If they had just started with killing the firstborn, the whole story would have been over, and then you wouldn't have had chapters 7 through 11, and it probably wouldn't have been as good a seller. By the way, it might sound funny to be a good seller, but don't think for a second that entertainment factor is insignificant. You are writing literature to gain people's imaginations. So 1 plague would have been rather anticlimactic. Okay.
Our time is coming. One more question, and then we can wrap up. One more question?
Actually, I have one, if you don't mind. It's something that's bothered me when I reflected on religious writings and priests, go back to the Druids even. Was this altruistic cleverness on their part? I mean, they knew this was good for people, and so we wrote these stories and constructed them the way they did to draw people to a more proper way of life. Maybe they didn't even believe it in God, that they knew they had to do something to get people's attention to live a decent life?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not known for avoiding cynicism, but I would suggest that this was not a cynical attempt to.
I don't mean cynical.
Yeah.
I just meant clever
Well,
altruism.
No, I think I started with Karl Mannheim's book, Utopian Ideology. I think even the priests, who had a pretty pedantic sense of how Judaism should look, had a vision of utopia. I tried to teach that. I mean, we may now look at bodily fluxes and scabs and the infection of the walls in our houses being, we can evaluate that socioeconomically and the monopoly that they had socioeconomically. But I believe that the priests themselves believed they were offering a utopian vision of how to organize life. So we can look at it questioning, but I don't. I take them as all quite sincere. And even the Deuteronomist, who does not want you to do Pesach at home, right? He wants it to be done in the shrine exclusively. He does it for sincere reasons. It is a utopian vision. But, so I start with that principle, that their goal is indeed utopian, which I also take to be a principle within Reform Judaism in the 19th century. To not see this as a utopian vision, I think is greatly mistaken. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That sure gives us a lot of thought and stimulating for what that means for all kinds of things, and how we understand the text, and also how we approach Haggadah, the Seder, and how it can things to change in terms of literature. So thank you so much for giving us that wonderful lecture. So we're going to have a break right now, and then come back in a few minutes to begin the next section. Thank you very much.